I think I'm going to just start. For those who don't know me, my name is Veena, and I work in the presentation infrastructure team in LinkedIn. I'm actually happy to say that few friends of ours from PayPal who also have been using Dust are here today. Just wave your hands. Actually, there's a good amount of people, so so feel free to talk to them and just encourage you to kind of say what you've been doing and share stuff. So appropriately titled, since there are a few folks outside of LinkedIn, I think I just titled my presentation as The Curious Case of Dust. Happened to be watching the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button last weekend, and then I thought, okay, similar questions on Dust. So bear with me. There's some stuff related to Dust. Sorry? I don't know how the presentation will fold into, but maybe you can draw some parallels. So this is basically going to be a boot camp, I was told, but since there's so much information to cover, I'm not going to be really doing any hands-on stuff, but there's a lot of code in these slides, and there's a lot of links to where you can actually see the code. There are just links and then wiki links to where you can find the code. And maybe we can have another cookbook recipe kind of session later, but so I'll get just started to give you what's been happening with the Dust. So just the agenda, since I call it the curious case, I think there are a few items people are curious about. It's been since almost a year we've started experimenting with Dust, and we have used quite a lot of it in the production already, and there's quite a lot of teams that are actively using it to build a lot of new features. So a few topics I'm going to cover. Who here has actually used Dust? Okay, I know my great group of the profile that I interact with daily that's used and been giving us a lot of feedback on how it could be made better. Dust is a templating language, and it's kind of called logicless. So everybody's really curious, I'm sure, to know and who have used it, that does logicless concept of logicless really work? Because most of the teams or most of the people are used to using something like JSPs or ERBs, where there's anything you could do there. So the question is we're making a cultural shift, we're making a paradigm shift into something like logicless, and has it really worked in LinkedIn? Or are people seriously bored and agitated and they don't want to use? So I'm going to answer that question.
And then just define logicless.
So logicless is a term that I think I'm going to use. I think some of my slides will tell you what it is down the line. But it's just an adaptation of what I think. So second question is, how many people here know what DRY means? Yeah, great. So it's not a very alien term then. It's basically dry. So concept of doing UI means that there's so much repetition that goes around, and then have we actually adapted patterns in Dust that lead to dry code is another question I think most people will be curious about. So I'm going to answer that. Dust basically is a client templating solution. So the third question I'm going to answer is, how much stuff are we doing on client and how much stuff we're not doing on client? And give you some reasons of what is that stuff that we're not actually doing on client. So lastly, I think this is something that I get asked. We made a cool blog post 8 months that we moved to Dust. So I want to give you some proof of really it is not just a blog post. We've been working hard in LinkedIn, trying to learn from others and developing a lot of infrastructure to use Dust widely at LinkedIn. So let's start. So before that, I saw a few hands raised saying that they've used Dust, but for people who haven't, and I just want to take account on how many people haven't even used Dust. Okay, there's a few. So my slides are not going to be totally a waste. So boring. This is what the site says. I don't even want to read. Anybody wants to read it? It says basically it's a JavaScript templating engine designed to provide a clean separation between presentation and logic without sacrificing ease of use. This is something, somebody who writes a book or somebody who's an architect in your team kind of tells you these big, bold things, right? And then they also say that it's a JavaScript library, and it runs on both browser and server-side environments. So this is probably most people would say, okay, whatever, that's fine. I mean, these are great definitions. So really tell me how it works. So if people have not used Dust, this is a simple depiction of how it works. 4 things you need to know when using Dust. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people come from the background of using JSPs and other templating languages, like Velocity templates is something that I used in my previous company that I was working in. Dust is a little bit different. It's a templating language, and it also comes with its JavaScript library. So there are 2 things you need to understand. So step 1, you basically write some markup. So if you look at the code, it's kind of doing something. It's trying to print somebody's name and say that how many messages it's got from whom all. And the data that these client templatings basically use is all JSON. And I don't think I need an introduction to anyone, give an introduction to anyone about what JSON is, right? It's the most known data protocol. And then there's JavaScript part, right? And the JavaScript part is the one that kind of ties these 2 things together, like the JSON that you have for data and the markup that you have. It ties both of them together, and then you have something to render. And the 4th step is basically when you render, using that function called dust.render, you end up creating HTML. So that's the basic crux of Dust. So nothing fancy, nothing super, no rocket science here. It's converting some piece of markup to actual HTML using JavaScript. People interested probably would know, okay, if this is it, I want to know more. Tell me more. Okay, so if people want to learn basic Dust, it's 2 main things they need to know. There's this concept of keys, which are also called as references to the JSON that actually, represent the data that the markup needs to render. And there's the concept of sections. You see that block sign there? That's as trivial as it is. You need to know 2 concepts: Dust keys, Dust sections. So most trivial use cases, basically you can create pages and render stuff just using these 2 things. References to the JSON, and then sections that actually loop over and iterate and enumerate a list of people. Like in profile, you can have list of groups, list of connections, list of companies, everything. This is a basic data structure, right? And then you loop, and then iterate, and then print. Done. But wait, is that it? Do you think we can build all of LinkedIn using just these 2 constructs, or is it as simple as that? So probably not. So this is some thinking cap on. I mean, I put this diagram up there because logicless, maybe this is the right time to introduce the concept of what logicless is, right? Dust is a templating language which is very clean, as I've told you in this slide. Not many constructs to learn. Not much conditional logic constructs are there. Like, you just print them. There's no way you can actually say if people of 0 do that, if people of 1 do this. And stuff like that. The basic Dust doesn't come with anything like that. So that's what logicless is. Logicless means that I can draw parallels to JSPs and give a different definition of logic. If you use JSPs and ERBs and GSPs, you have a lot of things you could do. You can actually even have the Java objects right in your template, right? You can have scriptlets. You can actually import the whole Java bean into your JSP and then do whatever you want. I think since LinkedIn uses its own JSPs, I've forgotten the real standard JSP syntax. But in general, I think any templating languages provide a rich set of things you could do, like include if, switch, like for loops, and then able to do a multitude of other logic right just in your template. The downside of some things like that is this. You basically convert your template to a controller. That we've seen many use cases even in LinkedIn. If you look at your some of the JSPs that LinkedIn code has, anything and everything can be done there. No one can stop you from doing it. What's the consequence of it? Basically, it becomes very not reusable. There's so much stuff and business logic sometimes riddled in them. There's so much A/B testing logic sometimes going on in those pages. In the JSP pages, that it's so hard to refactor and for someone to understand. So to really use logicless in the right way it's supposed to use, I don't think it was easy for us. At LinkedIn, I think most people have never been introduced to this concept of logicless templates. We did an evaluation of other templating languages, and I don't know, somehow we ended up picking this. Seriously, I didn't do any lobbying, but we did end up picking this up amongst 20 other templating languages we kind of looked at. So from then on, it was seriously to put your thinking hat on and then understand how well you can actually apply something like logicless and remain as much close to logicless as possible. So that's the part I'm going to understand, and like I've understood, and we worked in a group of people with a lot of front-end developers in LinkedIn, and that's what I want to share is a use case study of like what was it for us to move away from JSPs and use something like logicless templates and adapt to what LinkedIn really needs. May not be true for other companies, may not be true for every use case that you develop, but this is a pattern that kind of is relevant to LinkedIn, relevant to what LinkedIn is building. So here's an example of an actual example that's in code. I mean, in checked into our code base that you can go and look at, and then used in multiple of these features that I'll talk about. So very simple use case. So I have a bunch of snapshots here, but don't get overwhelmed. What you can see again here is the repeating pattern everywhere, right? So I know there are people who work in profile here, people who work in search team. I don't know if there's anyone here. There's the people you may know that's a landing page for you to connect to people at LinkedIn. And there's also like another landing page that tells you, if you're a Prime user or a subscribed user, I can actually see who's viewed my profile every day. And then, and these are some of the features. If you see in all of them, there is a very repeating pattern, right? It's basically giving you a list of people to display. And all of them, LinkedIn's feature is to kind of immediately display what your degree connection or your connection strength to that person is. For instance, if you see the thing that I've actually rounded, I don't think I have a pointer here, but if you see the things that I've rounded, it's a badge. It's a very small icon that we actually display in every single results page. It's a very trivial use case. All it's going to do is check your distance between you and the other person that you're viewing, and print if it's you're connected directly, you're a first degree connection or a second degree, or is he a group member, or is he a company group member, and things like that. So that's the use case we're going to look at and see how we actually a simple thing as this, adapting it to logicless wasn't trivial. So I'm going to walk you through that. Well, all of you might just say it's just a badge, it's just an image, it's just a text, a big deal. I mean, what's a big deal? I can easily adapt to it. But think about the use cases. We are a professional network, and I think we support around 25 languages here. Even a simple icon such as that degree icon, has localized text. So if you see this English, Turkey, Portuguese, they kind of have different. I don't know if it's kind of visible with the thing. It's very different. I mean, like it's not as an English text alone. So you can't simply do a client template and just print 1, 2, 3 or you first, second, or some kind of icon. There's an infrastructure that's around it that actually gives translated strings and localized strings to each one of those single text field that we're talking of. So outside it looks very trivial, but dig deeper, and if you're asked to implement, you need to worry about all these things. So again, if I were to ask you how you want to solve this, there are multiple answers I could give. It's not super difficult. I mean, are people with me and understand the comparison I'm trying to draw between doing things on the server side using something like JSP and then doing something on the client now using client templates? Just blindly raise your hands. Okay, so there is quite a bit of difference, and I want to highlight why there's a difference. Most often when you use something like JSPs or server-side languages, right, you have everything available to you on the server. It's just your domain, and you can do whatever you want. You can have libraries written that you have access to give you the localized string. And something like JSPs, you can do all kinds of logic. And I hope people have realized even in a simple degree icon, there's so much logic. And then we were trying to use logicless templates for view. So this is where, like Dust, you have to think deeper. And then when we actually selected Dust, one of the good things was, Dust comes with its inbuilt way of writing macros or like helpers. So these helpers could be a place where you actually do these repetitive things. When I say repetitive, because the same degree icon is used on 5 different pages, I don't think it makes sense for every team in LinkedIn to kind of repeat the same thing and then do the same thing. So this is no, again, rocket science. People have done that again and again in different languages, and we wanted to know if Dust can do it as well. So there is possibility of doing that, and we do that with Dust helpers. And to give you a very plain layman's definition, think of it as just a macro or a tag. And then I'm sure in every language that you've worked so far, there's an equivalent of that. JSP tags, I'm sure there are parallels that we drawn in every templating language that was written from day one to right now. But there are certain templating languages like Mustache. I don't know if you've heard of Mustache. That's one of the most commonly used logicless templating languages in many companies, as I've seen. That is one that actually doesn't give you this flexibility very easily. It doesn't allow you to, even move away. It's very bounded to being logicless. It doesn't like the concept of logic, and it never wants to, give you any room to extend it. But Dust is somewhere a bridge, we thought, between purely logicless to something we could extend. And why we wanted to extend is a very simple reason. There's two kinds of logic. There is business logic. For instance, if I want to actually show someone's last name, it's kind of a business logic too, right? Because maybe LinkedIn makes money just by hiding someone's last name. There are cases like that we do. Because we are a professional site, and then we do have features like that. And if you're a premium user, you probably want to show this much, and if you're not a premium user, you don't want to show some other data. There's logic like that. That could be actually business logic. And we don't want to really do that on templates. But there is other kind of logic as well. Purely rendering. Like for when you use SAS or CSS, I don't know if people are familiar with that. There is a UI treatment that you apply on these templates or views that kind of tell, if the person's, for the first 3 items, I want this kind of CSS class, and the last 3 items, I want another type of CSS class. This is purely rendering logic, and it's nothing to do with application logic. Think about another use case. For instance, you're developing something for mobile, and then also you're developing for web, and because these days you're bound to have that decision making or kind of in the team, because we want to go mobile and we want to develop for both mobile and web. There may be less real estate in mobile, and then you want to make some decision on showing only 2 items in the list. And then in web you have more real estate, so you probably want to show 10 items in the list. So these are very specific presentation or rendering logic, and these are not application logic. So the biggest contention with these kinds of templating languages, if you think really hard, is where do you put these things? Do you put it in the controller? Do you put it in your, your Ruby controller, your Java controller, or do you send that kind of data every time back and forth? It's good that everything is one place. Your logicless templates are super dumb. They just convert whatever data you want into HTML, and you're done. The downside to it is you're actually sending down a lot of information that could actually be just simply very easily derived on the client too. You don't have to push back and forth that payload. And one of the biggest benefits of doing something like client templates is to minimize the payload that you actually send every time down to the browser. So it was just a conflict we had to face with and think hard on what we choose. Do we actually stay purely logicless for the heck of it, to be really ideologically logicless, or we try to make some bridge between the two? So that's where helpers come into picture, and then I'll show you some code snippets of what a helper could do. And if you were wondering how you could actually implement, so this is one of the slides that I went to PayPal, I think 3 months back, and then I had Bill's name on it, and I'm reusing the slide. So that's Bill Scott, who is it's Bill Scott, who is as part of the PayPal team. So if I want to actually on my page, and I go and view Bill's profile, and then he happens to my first degree connection, right? And I want to print this degree icon. This is a typical code you could write. I mean, it just works. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. And there is some logic. Logic basically is kind of compare the value distance. So as I told you, distance is that connection that LinkedIn sends you. Like if I'm connected to Nipun directly, it's the 0. If I'm connected to Walter indirectly, there's a distance of 2 or 3, depending on a relationship with that person. So that value alone could be used on the client in the template. And actually you can print out localized strings. We were talking about localization, right? And then you can see these usages of helpers there. You notice the at notation. I don't have a pointer, but I mean that's the at is the at I18N. These are all very inbuilt constructs of Dust. I mean, there is nothing that we had to do. All you have to do is kind of implement these helpers. And these helpers can be purely in JavaScript if you chose to do. And I'll tell a little bit later down why sometimes we choose not to do purely JavaScript, but these two trivial. It's just a localized string. You can actually send localized translations down into the browser. You can cache them. It's a lookup table you could do in your client in JavaScript, and then whenever you see something like you can actually pick up the right language string and actually render it. Seems very interesting. So step one, we actually did this. I mean, we thought, okay, it's not bad. Let's try to do whatever logic we want to do with respect to rendering on the client, and then we use this. So here's a couple of things. I mean, the FMT is kind of missing because I did the presentation in the morning and I didn't bother to check, I think. So there's logic, that's addif, and then there's localized text, there's an at-18 and helper. So if you're wondering what the code looks like, it's really like, I don't want to go into the detail, but that's why I made the font size really small so that nobody could read it. But that's the link to the GitHub. We maintain our stuff on the GitHub. It's open. Anybody can look through the source. It was a pretty straightforward thing. What you do in if is basically you take a statement, whatever you're saying, distance equal to 0. It's plain JavaScript there, right? And you're trying to do an expression parser, or we dumbly use an eval, but at the end of the day, it's like a simple expression parser there can actually, on JavaScript, do your logic. And this is right there. We didn't have to do anything. We basically used all the powerful thing that JavaScript in itself provides. We don't have to build a new library. We didn't have to write new code to support this. It just worked. And there's also there is also another construct, very similar, called select we came up with. There are people very simply want to make, I think I'm missing the code, but it's very similar to if, wherein you can check if this equal to distance 1, then print u. If it's equal to distance 2, then print first degree connection. So very simple helpers that heavily rely on the core of JavaScript. So you're not inventing a new language, you're not inventing any new library, it's just JavaScript in the end. The downside, you have to basically put these helpers down to the client, make sure it works in all browsers. It's sometimes, some of these browsers may not be good at, executing JavaScript as the template is rendering, and then you may have some performance issues, and you need to be wary of that. But that still works, and we have a lot of pages using this on LinkedIn, and then it seems to be not really hindering how a developer writes these templates, because now they are not worrying about doing this logic on the controller. There are cases in LinkedIn where we have a group of people who do the front end, and then there's a group of people who do the back end. And it was so odd that, and most of our backend stack is Java or JVM stack. For good or bad, we've been using that. We've been scaling our site using it, and then we've stuck to it. We've not moved to any cool thing like Rails. Since 8 years we've been using a Java stack, and we're okay with that. So there is this big divide sometimes that happens between people who write these templates and people who write this Java code. It's not like they don't like each other, but they just find that there is a lot of friction in communicating. Depending on someone else to actually have a piece of data coming back in JSON it's not something that makes iterative development quicker. So this kind of stuff having all on the client is a huge benefit for people who actually just do templating and just want to build stuff. And that's really helped us. So hold your breath there, and I'll come back to a little bit more downsides of those helpers, but we'll continue our talk and then understand our second use case of how we can improve what we did in the first one using logic, and use something like another construct of dust by means what it is like it's a construct that allows you to use reusable markup. So are we dry? Are we actually so you saw that code which had an if helper and everything. It's still kind of if 5 people want to use that, you don't want them to repeat that same snippet in 5 different places, right? Because you want to add another degree tomorrow. Maybe LinkedIn comes up with another degree distance relationship. Maybe you're connected to that student. You don't want to go and change in every single template. So you want to isolate that whole block that we actually saw here into its own markup that's reusable. And that's where this concept of partials come in. And again, this is not rocket science or anything new to Dust. Any templating language usually should provide something like this. You have include JSPs. I'm sure you have included templates in ERBs. And Dust also answers this quite a bit by the term called partial. So like I'm sure people who used to like, Ruby and stuff understand this term much better. So basically, quick definition, it's a nested template. So it's like a template within a template, nothing different from your parent template. The beauty of it is as access to the scope of the parent. The way kind of Dust works is anything, if you write a lot of partials, the partials have a way to walk up to the parent's data. And Dust usually works in the context of the JSON that you've actually given it to render. And your JSON can have, nested maps and nested keys within those maps. And that's typically how a real world data looks like, right? You have people, and then you have, degrees, and then the degrees may have some data related to schools, and then you have multiple nestings going on. So Dust kind of is able to walk up and down this JSON tree that you have and resolve the Dust reference. Partials also inherently get that. There is nothing specific that you have to do for partials. And they inherit or thrive on the data that the parent template has. It's a specific notation that you have to be aware of if you start using, like you had the @ for helpers, the grammar, which again, it's on the Dust site, and it's a very clean grammar. It's written in PEG, which is a parser generated grammar. The greater than sign basically indicates to the Dust grammar that it's a partial. So as simple as that. Another very interesting aspect that most people may not know, and I call it like the little less known facts of Dust, is that the partial name can be very dynamic. And I think this is where the subtlety of logic was injected into it. So I'll show you how we transform the if helper into something different, which uses the inbuilt partial construct, and then still we are able to do logic. So this is a comparison of what we did. Like this was a second iteration. We started learning Dust, and then we had used those if helper everywhere. But what that if helper was basically doing was, okay, I have a distance, and then I want to basically either render the data for degree 0 or render the data for degree 1 and stuff like that. So here's an interesting use case when people were like experimenting, they came up with. I'm going to create a partial, which is called badge. Right? It's the main partial, like it's the parent of that thing. And then I'm able to actually create a few more. This is a very simplistic use case, so I'm sure you might be wondering, oh, this is one line of text, why do I need to create a new file? But then, that's a debate you can have with me again. But badge 1 and badge 2 are basically two other partials. You know how cleanly they do logic here? It's inbuilt logic. So when the distance, in the example of the JSON, there are two items in the people array. One, the name is Jim and the distance is 2. The second one, his name is Aaron and the distance is 1. It just loops over, figures out the value of the distance, and if the value of distance is 1, it invokes badge1.tl, and if the value of the distance is 2, it invokes badge2.tl. As simple as that. I mean, this was some kind of a hidden thing that we didn't discover in the beginning, and that avoids a lot of use cases where you have to do if or select or equals check. And this is something, as we've seen, 30 to 40% of the logic cases are pretty much this. So you can, if you try harder, you can actually make Dust work for what you want to work for. And in some other cases, like IIT-NEN, I'm sure we end up using a helper. So there are ways you can actually tweak your solution to something that the actual language is giving you. So
explain why you chose to make two partials for badge 1 and badge 2 instead of just making a badge partial that takes the distance, since it's in the parent context, and does an if inside of that. Is there a train of thought behind that choice?
So that's the basic train of thought between logicless or not logic, right? There is an inbuilt support here, which the Dust.js JavaScript library itself builds in logic into it. It's kind of subtle if you look at it, because distance is a dynamic key there, and then it either resolves to the if is kind of embodied in just resolving the value distance, right? If the distance is 1, it resolves to partial 1. If distance is 2, it resolves to partial 2. Do I have to explicitly run JavaScript about Dust to do that? It seems like an overkill, right? It's more of like clean thing. Thinking about it as clean.
There's some JavaScript going on that does that dynamic resolution for you, right?
Yep. But then we end up creating our own helper, and then we introduce some more concepts for people to learn. Like less constructs to learn, less new things to know is always a good thing for people to ramp up and understand.
I think the big difference with these kind of templating is that data is the interface to drive. So if you present the data the correct way, the template's run without any logic. The if being the exception that's been added here, right? So it's a different way of looking at it. It's not necessarily as really right or wrong, but it forces this data contract with the backend, and that's kind of the beauty of the logicless templating. And even though it's feels a little forced here.
So I just
Yeah, but that's
so what would happen if we had a distance 3 but don't have a badge 3?
If you don't have a distance, in that case, you actually can fall back. I mean, we have a way, I mean, we have adapted that. I'll go through that in the example. That's a great question. So you can always have a default value set for distance. So I'll go through that a little bit. And then that's a good question, right? I mean, some things are by default there and some things you have to think through. I mean, these are like use cases that when you start experimenting, you come to know that. I mean, that's a great question. So this is where, it joins into what he asked, and we thought about it, and again, these are all, very deep discussions. You might think, like she spends her time thinking about templating, really? Is it all? Yeah, actually, is it all? So when we look at code and people write, and then you want to maintain that code for a long time, and you want like LinkedIn is hiring a lot of people, new people coming, and then they want to look at these and then immediately understand what to do. Most often I'm like, I'm going to copy paste someone else's code and then just get it working, right? I mean, I don't want to think. But there are other sections of people who actually want to directly dig deeper into doing something clean, doing something that's actually easy to understand. And then when we started experimenting with these use cases, we thought, what can we do more? Because there are some use cases wherein, they're very LinkedIn specific. There are cases where, you want to restrict the scope of the JSON that a partial gets. So if you see the example here, anything that's above people is available to the partial. There are constructs that I don't want to go dig deeper to actually avoid that. There is a dot notation you can use on the reference keys to actually restrict the scope to the local, so that if there was a distance outside of people, it doesn't walk up and then use that distance. But what we can do as a team working together is like avoid those kind of issues down the line, and people don't have to learn a lot of things. So one thing that came up was where there's a lot of code here, but bear with me. I wish I had a pointer. But the one example that constantly asked question is in JSPs and stuff. There was a way to actually restrict the scope of the data to what that partial was using, so that dust doesn't randomly walk up the tree of the JSON and then figure out something outside the scope of what it needs to. So here's an example of a template, and you will see a helper that we've written called @partial. I mean, naming may not be very obvious, but this is what we basically end up doing. And @partial is very similar to @if or @select and stuff that we talked about. It restricts the scope of what you want to pass into member photo. Member photo is another partial which is heavily used. If you look at this example that I showed you in the beginning, that is a small logic that you do to check if people have uploaded their members, you actually show their dynamic photo that they've uploaded, or you show a no photo image. Like the first box that I have, which is like a dummy user that I created, it doesn't have a user. I mean, doesn't have a member photo, so you want to just show a no photo image. As simple as that. So this is a logic that kind of repeats everywhere. You want to either show a link to the member or you want to show a link to the no photo thing. So when you have things like that, and we realize, okay, it's important that all it needs is two pieces of information, whether there exists a picture ID or not, and then if it is, print the member ID URL or don't print it. Don't get into the details. The crux of this is basically it's a single if-else thing. Would we go and do this as a dynamic partial? It seems too trivial. I mean, you want to create a partial for one line of text? I mean, people would say, no, really, I don't want to do that. So we ended up creating a single partial with this, exist check. And there is some inbuilt constructs in Dust to do that logic. It's not like it's purely logicless. There are exist checks. So the question mark that you see is basically checking if exists picture ID in the JSON. Print this. If it doesn't exist, print the one that's below. So there is some support. Again, compared with Mustache, it doesn't have any of these inbuilds. So this simple example, anything below here, which is under, so this we do some kind of documentation that kind of tells you, oh, this is a reusable partial. It takes two parameters, whether alt text in that image and then picture ID that you want to actually do an exist check on. These are the only two things it needs. It doesn't need anything else. So you can actually, get to it and then and do it. So this is an example where you want to restrict the scope to just what you want. And that's where a helper comes into picture. And then degree icon could be actually used in this way too. I mean, there's another pattern. So we don't say it always has to be done the way we talked about. This is kind of mixing a partial with the helper syntax. It gives us a way to document and for people to kind of look at it and say, okay, these are all already available. I don't want to reinvent the solution and then create some more markup that's just only for my application. So we want less of those duplications happening across. Again, this helper code is out there. I don't want to go into the details. Anybody who knows JavaScript, anybody who knows a little bit of logic can understand it. It just gives you a lot of flexibility into accessing the objects that it exposes in its JavaScript library. There's 4 KB compressed JavaScript library that we download. It has everything that we talked about for doing rendering and doing everything. And that code also exposes a few APIs, you could say, or objects that you could operate on, and then write your custom helpers to do that. So you can look at that. That's pretty much what we do for @partial. This is another example. So most people would ask this question, you know about templating, but usually markup is never free of JavaScript and controls. We're slightly moving to using jQuery here. We were like a huge YUI shop. A lot of our JS controls, that's what we call, that's the lingo we use in LinkedIn, and I'm sure people who have done feature development here understand what a control is. It's basically a LinkedIn thing for a JavaScript widget. A widget that you could actually do type ahead on. You want to actually show a carousel, you want to show an accordion, things like this. And there are some app-specific widgets people write to. So they're called like controls. And that's a helper. We basically converted that to an helper too because that was all JavaScript. And mostly these controls take in configuration parameters, right? Sometimes you want to print some I18 and localized text into it. Sometimes you want to determine if its education ID is this, do this effect on that, and if it's something else, do that. So it kind of seamlessly falls into what we were doing. There's nothing very specific about it. And again, that helper code is on that gist. It's some basic JavaScript that adds some script blocks, does lazy loading of these controls so that you don't do inline rendering of these JavaScript as they are walked through. Again, it's a bit of LinkedIn specific thing, but nothing very fancy. It's a super straightforward concept of lazy loading these JavaScript libraries on after page load, and then kind of initializing their data. So if a page's homepage has actually probably, I just did a check, like 45 of those controls. Some of those controls are actually initialized on load. Some of those are done only on click events, or like when you do an infinite scroll or things like that. So the biggest thing we had to do was, how do you pass data into these kind of controls? Plainly via dust. I mean, there's nothing specific we had to do about it. Write a helper, pass data directly into it. Again, not much. So these are the 2 use cases that I brought about, and then I have a slide of questions, but bear with me, this is not the end of the presentation. But then I wanted to stop and then ask people if I'm talking too much, that it's an OHD, or you guys have questions to any of these things that we've gone through. Yeah.
So if you have like just a Dust template TL file, and then on the client in JavaScript you do a render, what happens? Does it actually make an AJAX call to go get that TL file? Or do you have to somehow embed that template into your HTML?
That's a very good question. So most often, right, like when you see and read it on the web, and that's what most people do, like they embed the JavaScript right in like a script tag or something into the HTML, and that is in a HTML block, and then do get element by ID on the ID of the script, and then you use that. But that's not what we really wanted, because our IDEO was able to cache them, and that's the whole beauty of JavaScript templates, that you don't want to download them again. We CD and cache them. So we treat all of these templates as just another JavaScript file. So I get into the details of it a little bit down the slide, but we treat them just like JavaScript files, download them once, and just like the JS control uses its own JavaScript file to do the stuff, we have a mechanism to access the right template. And it's very simple concept. What the Dust library does is compiles the template into a JavaScript function. I'll show you the snippet of what a JavaScript function looks like. And that function registers into a Dust cache on the local cache on the browser. That's it. And we didn't do that. It comes automatic from the Dust library, and it was a neat way. So you download through script source tags all these templates, keep them, and you're done. So when you call dust.render, it's a trivial check for the render library. If the template exists in that hash map, it'll render it. If it doesn't, it'll throw an error. So that's just the connection between the 2 things.
So we have a bunch of helpers that are already in place, what's the best practice around having custom helpers, or who controls what kind of helpers go in? Because once you start adding helpers, it's as good as having custom code that, again, people don't understand.
So I'm like the queen of just here and I control everything. No, just kidding. So I think it's been a conscious decision in our community of like whoever's using it to be very careful of what really constitutes as a helper, what really constitutes as a partial. We've had like wiki documentation on as like a table that says plus and minuses between that. One thing that I can share is like some things that have markup and stuff, really they don't need to be helpers. And some things that can be done with inbuilt Dust features, do we need a helper, may not. And so instead of actually writing a if helper, when we started writing code, you could see people actually wrote something like, and I don't remember the name, it was like basically it was called a threshold helper that would check if A is greater than some threshold, do this, right? That means they were inventing every single logic helper possible in their own way. And it was called like homepage threshold helper. And then profile count helper. Yes, you can do like 25 variations of each of them. So one thing that we've done really cleanly is, and I'll tell you down in the slides why people can't do their own helpers, because we control them, in a very, people don't realize that we control them. And I'll tell you the trick to that down in the slides. So the question, to answer Prachi's question, first thing is education, right? Basically tell people not to really write any custom helpers. And if there's a strong need for it, we should make it generic enough and then talk about it as like how it can be made generic enough. And then if you strongly need there's something, yes, it could be promoted as one of the generic helpers and it gets onto everyone. So it's just basically on the usage, yeah.
How do the payload sizes compare with doing the logic on the client versus doing it on the server? Do you compare like apples to apples with like a single page, what the payload looks like? Because you mentioned the mobile use case, and I understand like you can cache it and get a great benefit from caching it, but I would never want to send all the content for a desktop page to a mobile device when you're in a situation where people are paying for that data, or you have poor network connectivity or things like that.
Great. I think again that depends a little bit on what kind of like controller logic you do. When you use plain logic lists, I think our mobile site uses underscore templates. Sorry to break the news, they don't use just. They use underscore templates, and I think the concept of like node, they use node, and it's a very JavaScript driven thing. And for them, I think they do all this data munging, decoration of data right at the server, and then give something that's totally just ready to use on the client. So I can go both ways, right? I mean, the payload versus the amount of time you spend doing this logic on the browser, like even that is expensive. So there is no clean answer, I would say. Even in mobile, it's between the bandwidth and the time that you want to render. If you want your mobile to be snappy, you are sure thinking about latencies of rendering, right? Time you're executing JavaScript, time you're trying to do all these helpers there. So mobile is a different use case, I believe, and web is a different use case, I think. I mean, concepts that sometimes you apply for mobile are not applicable to web. One other thing that I want to say is like, we actually do mobile apps. We don't do like mobile as, we do hybrid apps. So we're very targeted to WebKit browsers. We can actually understand the performance characteristics and stuff that happens on each of them. So we have more leverage, but the scenario might just change totally if you want to do HTML5 apps, not hybrid apps, then you have to target every other browser, not just the WebKit browser. So the debate of how much you want to send down and how much you want to do at the client is just very use case specific, I think. But what I can tell you is that that's the flexibility we wanted to give. There should be constructs on web. If people want to do things on the client, they can. And if you don't want to do it on the client, they can as well do it in the controllers. It also is orthogonal problem that we face is, as we said, we have a divide of developers that do some part of Java and some part of JavaScript. It's between, again, those people in those team to decide how they want to do it. And then measure the performance and then make adjustments as they go about it. And another clean answer is we haven't done that kind of analysis. That's something we want to do. We haven't done that. Like between payload sizes of X bytes to Y bytes, is that a big difference?
So then, I mean, just go back to like trying to understand like the payload, what that looks like. You mentioned like a Dust template for this very small, showing this very small icon on the page, right? So I'm envisioning that whole page is made up of maybe hundreds of templates, right? Like all nested and everything. Where, if you need to decide whether that is going to be like, if you're saying there's like some trade-off, so some decisions you're gonna make on the server and some on the client, but there's all these nested templates, what ability do you have to make that decision anywhere else other than the client?
So the two things I think people often confuse are kind of not clear. There's the downloading of the templates and the downloading of data. They're two separate things. Templates are cacheable. So you download them once, you get the hit once, and they're cached forever, right, on the CDN. So even if you had thousands of these partials in your LinkedIn, it's fine. We cache them, and how often do we change them? It depends on that. Like if you change them, of course, your cache gets invalidated and you take the hit again. The data is a different aspect. So we would always say download as many templates as you want and cache them on the client, or use local storage if like there are browsers that you're supporting local storage. Mobile heavily uses local storage. So for them, downloading hundreds of these templates is no big deal. But the data part is a very tricky thing. So that's what I think I was elaborating more on. Wherein how much data you send, how much stuff you do on the client is very specific to the use case. Does it answer?
So, I don't know, so you're gonna control which templates are actually rendered based on the data you send
Yep.
back. So all that's going to be side on the server side.
Yep.
So you might download
Yeah, we do
a
that.
template for 200 widgets or whatever, and then you're going to get data for 10 of them. Like that's.
So we control based on, maybe I'll talk a little bit more on the downside. So we do control on the server side what template goes onto the browser if it's a dynamic like template, like badge 1, badge 2, badge 3. I mean, if you're doing a use case of like 20 people, like chances of you not downloading something like badge 100 might be highly, highly unlikely, right? Because there would be no connection on your thing that is like not connected. But there may be other use cases where lazy load stuff too. A template could be lazy loaded, doesn't have to come as a payload in the beginning when the page loads. So that's another helper that actually determines, okay, this is an AJAX call, we're trying to render some AJAX snippet, don't have the template yet, I'm just going to make a call to the CDN, to the static content thing and download it then. So these templates would be lazy loaded too. It again depends on your thing, whether you want a snappy experience at the beginning, or these are like user click or action-based features that you can defer the loading of the template later too. So that's again flexible. So I'll just get onto the slide. So we talked about Dust, basic Dust. Anybody outside of LinkedIn can use that the way it is. Nothing prevents you, but we've adapted a lot of that to actually build some apps that are truly uses this concept of Dust to its core. And many people ask this question, okay, it's great to actually do modules of the page in Dust and AJAX pages in Dust. You make an AJAX call, get the JSON, you load the template when you want, and then you combine it with the film and you do it. How do you kind of unify using even for like the base page, or like there should be some bootstrap that you have to always render on the server. And I don't know how many people understand that, and it's there's no way you can actually send a payload of JSON even for the page and ask the browser to do it, right? I mean, it needs to have the open HTML body and the closing body and the HTML to even start doing JavaScript. So that's the bare bones of things that you always need to know, and that we kind of do it with a server-side rendering engine, which is a JavaScript engine. So the flow of things is very simple. I've simplified the whole end-to-end stack we use, and I'll introduce some terms that we use down the line. And this falls into how we are trying to write dry code. Dry code not just in terms of partials, but dry code much in terms of these UI, modules or embeds that can be like mix and matched on any other page. The biggest productivity gain we get is from doing that, because otherwise we've seen in the past that people in every domain just rewrite their whole modules by themselves in their own language. It takes a lot of time to iterate. The design sometimes is awkward because you switch from one page to another page. There's so much inconsistencies even in a CSS thing. So we want to avoid that, and I think we would try striving really hard. I don't say we're there yet. We're striving really hard to actually bring consistency across the site, consistency across mobile and web down the line. So that's where our, we have a proxy sitting in front of our browsers, that before it hits your real web app, be it your, Tomcat or J2B or Netty or anything, kind of sits there and makes some informed decisions on, what it needs to do. Whether this is a page that is Dust, so I'm going to render the base of it and send it back. If it's a module that's like called from an AJAX, I'm going to make a pass-through because the client is going to do the rendering. And we also want to make informed decisions about cases where certain pages are SEO pages and we actually want to always render it on the server and not render on the client. There may be a case where, it's a new feature. We don't want to expose all this logic we have in templates. It's an A/B tested thing, and then we don't want to download it. And those are like, again, use case by use case. You decide whether you want to do on server. The beauty of these Dust templates, which if anybody paid attention to the first few slides of definition of what a JavaScript template is, it seamlessly allows you to render on client or server. That means you write once, you don't worry about it. There's an infrastructure piece that takes care of either rendering that stuff on to HTML and sending HTML back, or sending JSON and template back. So that's the part that we call the JSON aggregator and the V8 engine. So it sits there. We're trying to scale it and productionalize it and then use it in a lot of traffic. It's getting there. But that was the second part of what we wanted to do with Dust templating and unification of our front-end stack. And then other concepts, and I'm sure people who do front-end development are aware of the fact that you have your JavaScript and CSS. We treat our templates just like JS. So we don't store them in the web app like JSPs are stored. We store them on the CDN thing, which we call in our thing called in a static content store. We store them there. So that's how, like, if a template changed, the CDN talks to your static content server and then gets the new version. If it didn't change, then it'll just always go to CDN. So that means you avoid that back and forth down to your actual data center. So this is a simplistic concept, and those concepts that repeat in your head is like, what do you mean by page? What do you mean by embed? Let's go through those things quickly. So this is an example of a homepage here, right? I just did a snapshot in the morning. This is my homepage. A lot of things here. It says a network update feed, and then you have like people, folks, don't feel a little odd. Maybe this is a new styling that's still yet to be released to be public. I hope I don't get into trouble with LinkedIn, but this is probably looks a little different from your own LinkedIn homepage. But this is a typical homepage. The stream is its own module. There is a people you may know stuff, and I'm a Prime user. I'm a subscribed user, and my homepage I actually get to know who view my profile every day, so I can actually know who's stalking me and who wants me to come and work for them. So those are the modules on homepage that you show, and these are like actually owned by different domains in LinkedIn, and each of them basically develops this data for them. They own the data differently. But what happens with the UI is every team vertically repeats the same thing. So in homepage, they have their own PyMK JSPs, and the profile, if they have the same module, they have their own PyMK JSPs. Everybody is just repeating the same UI treatment, sometimes inconsistent UI treatment across pages. If you switch between homepage and profile, it's so inconsistent. So we want to avoid that. And how do we solve that is, this is a page we want to have in future. Typical page, and anybody could talk about it. It's again, nothing new. It has a layout. Layout basically gives you, the top, the bottom part, open HTML and stuff, and then you can have some CSS and JS as part of the page. And these layout and pages that I'm talking of can have these embeds. So if you're wondering what embed means, here's it is. Again, this picture may not be clear. So the top part is an embed, right? The bottom part is an embed, and the NUS itself is an embed. You will see the NUS, which is the network update stream, that's the internal word that we use, is used on every single page, and that's what gives us a lot of interaction and engagement. You use it in profile, you use it in company pages, you use it in every single page. And we want to develop that once. We don't want to develop that even the UI again and again. And this is where probably the biggest benefit of embeds comes. So to reiterate, are we trying to move towards dry? Yes. And I think these embeds within themselves will have these degree icon partials, and that gives us this flexibility of actually moving towards developing something that is already available for you to use. And that's basically an embed. What we've talked so far, a recap on, like, you've used helpers, you can use partials, you can use any just stuff, and then you write an embed. And if you ask me why we came up with this concept of embed, I'll give you another story about it. I'll just make it up right now. So the story goes like this. So on our homepage, we used to have a lot of throttling, because there are different services that it talks to. I mean, actually, I've heard it's like 35 different services it talks to render the homepage. Sounds amazing, because we are probably the best example of a service-oriented architecture. So 35 different services, and some days, some service goes down, and the entire page would not render. And some of those modules on that page are super not important. I mean, would I really be affected by the module who view my profile not showing up for like a few minutes? No. So the concept of embeds also gives us a very granular thing of controlling. If that service did not come back, I'm going to degrade it. I'm gracefully going to render the rest of the page, and I'm going to throw that piece out. I'm just going to not worry about that embed. And when that service is back up and healthy, I'm going to start rendering that embed. That gives us this perspective of you can control, and when page developers are writing, they look at a particular embed on their page is really important, not important. And then you can kind of tag them as something that I don't care if it goes down, you can still render. So something like this, hopefully developers don't make the header not required, because you really want to render a header, and if the header didn't come back, you want to actually show a header page because that's bad user experience. But maybe something like who Veena profile is something that's not required. So this was an also orthogonal design decisions to kind of use dust templates and embeds, and then come up with this proxy. So the diagram here, that JSON aggregator, is that smart proxy that kind of gives you when to drop an embed, not to drop an embed, and then go on with life. And a page code looks very simple as well. This is the simplest page again. I mean, you might have more things. So you can have stuff like CSS and JS declared on the page, and then you can have a lot of other things. So there are script FS embeds that you see that kind of tell you, this is a PYMK embed, is a Veena profile. And the way that proxy works is, it looks at this initial payload that you send. You write this template and we send this payload back to the proxy. It parses for these specific embeds and then makes an internal data center call. So it's not an AJAX call. So every embed is basically a call to an internal web app, gets the JSON that it needs, and then aggregates them together. That's why we call it the aggregator. And then if you can mark a certain embed as server-side rendered. So there are cases where you don't want the initial flicker, or sometimes you have a browser in IE that really badly renders on JavaScript. So we can have a tag on these embeds. Very simple. We don't really. I've read about Mojito and Yahoo. It gives a lot of flexibility. Ours is, we don't need that kind of super flexibility. We need a way to tag a particular embed as required or not, whether it should be rendered on the server or not. If it is tagged as render, there's an attribute which is missing here, then the proxy will try to use a V8 engine, render the HTML, and then send it back. So there may be decisions made based on the browser that you're actually rendering. So that's the infrastructure we have. So going back to the third question before I end, I know there's people who are probably like, how long will this go? Maybe another 15 minutes. Please feel free to move if you have any other thing. But some stuff that I want to cover here is, I don't know how much of you people think that we don't try to do everything on the client. I think we've a very conservative company, we've seen. We try to move slowly. We try to incrementally make changes. And a lot of the stuff that we don't want to do on client, we don't do it on the client. So that's our thing. So when we talked about client rendering, this was like everybody wrote back to us after we did the blog post. Great, LinkedIn is doing client template rendering. Cool story. I mean, it's amazing, right? But think about in terms of a team that you're doing performance as well. Not all browsers are made equal. That's the bottom line. Not all browsers perform the same way in terms of executing JavaScript. So the story looks cool, but I think we have been very conservative on rolling out everything to be client rendered. And we want to take a very incremental step. So let's talk about this. What's this curious case of client rendering? Does it apply everywhere? So one thing that always gets confused, when I talk about client rendering is people think we're using this cool backbone knockout and spine. I don't know how many people have heard of this. It's not client MVC we're trying to do here. We want to get there, mobile uses, but I think we're again slowly learning how much of JavaScript can be downloaded, how many types of browsers we want to support. So when I say client rendering, it's not client MVC. So that's a disconnect. So I think my slide should have been termed as something as how much not on the client, right? I mean, I've been talking of client templates, but I think that's little focus on how much not on the client, and that might answer some of the questions that Brad asked and stuff like that. So how much not on the client? We've seen that if you try to compile that template into JavaScript on the client, it's really bad. So on the server, we pre-compile them. So what gets down to the browsers is not the markup that you wrote. So if you ever try to debug into the Firebug and want to see the exact line that you wrote in your markup, you will not find it. So don't try to do that. So what happens is a transformation of this code into something that you don't understand. It looks something like this, but what it's basically is a JavaScript function, very simple concept. It tries to register this whole function into chunks or bodies of objects. And then when you do dust.render, it's executing this JavaScript function. And that's where the speed comes from for Dust. If you ended up actually compiling this on the client and then doing it or trying to do some kind of a regex and then look for every Dust reference within a curly brace, it will be awful. So that's where I call it a JavaScript template. Second thing, I mean, right, for instance, like Brad asked, there's like a distance variable there, and then like, how do you kind of aggregate all of these templates that have to be downloaded to the client? I mean, what kind of logic goes there? We could have done it as a helper. If you do it as a client-side helper, that means you're waiting until you download the payload to figure out what partials you want to download, right? That's a bad experience we've seen. I mean, sometimes, you know, there's bad connection. That means there's a spinning wheel that's trying to download the template when the user clicks on it, and then it's not good. So we do some kind of server-side processing of these templates. And I'll talk a little bit down in the next 2 slides. The reason we did it was like the grammar is open source. It's there, and then we basically built our Antler version. I don't know how many people know Antler, which is basically another expression, parser expression grammar, which is out there, pretty robust and used. Porting that into using something in Java was super, super simple. Why did we do Java? I'll answer that question in the next slide too. It so happens that LinkedIn is not a 2-year-old company. It's almost here for 8 years, and there's so much infrastructure that we've written for doing stuff on the client in Java. And hate it or love it, you have to use it, or you can try to rewrite everything, which we are embarking on, but it is a long process. To rewrite any of those libraries into something in JavaScript, it's a long process. So there are 2 reasons we ended up writing something like a port of Dust grammar into Java. One, we wanted to do things on the server, because we don't rely on every other browser to do that thing for us well. And second, we wanted to leverage some of the stuff that we have. So that's the next slide. I basically spoke about it. And that stuff is again going to be open source. We're working so hard on what we did in the trick. And in one slide, I'll go through the thing. So they're very similar to client helpers. Like you wrote about if, and people who want to work in using Dust, and one of the biggest users is the profile team that's sitting there, would have come across these things. Instead of writing a client helper, we ended up writing a server-side helper. Exactly same syntax as a client helper would, but there is a namespacing we use something called pre at LinkedIn. I mean, I'm sure you could use SS or like Veena or Bill or anything. I mean, it means something on the server for people, that's it. And that namespacing tells us while we are processing this template on the server, that this helper is not something client understands. This helper is not something that, JavaScript oriented. This helper is something that I'm going to like understand on the server, parse that template, and then basically evaluate what the value for that helper is. So I'll go through this in diagram. I mean, it might look heavy for you, but look through this. I'm trying my best, but I don't know if it's easy. So very simple concept is this. If you paid attention to what I was talking of, there is a map of data that you give it to the template to render, right? That's all Dust rendering is about. I mean, not just about Dust. Any template rendering is all that. It needs data, it needs your markup, and then it tries to marry both of them and then render something. So on the way down, what we do is, so if you see the example at the top, there's a people's list, which has some things like first and last name. That's like the domain data we get from LinkedIn. We have a RESTly services or APIs down there that actually give us JSON. So the JSON is very clean and very true to its domain. It doesn't have all this formatted logic or formatted or localized strings. The part that we want to solve is, instead of driving every single library that we have for formatting down to the client, and maybe we don't even know how well it performs on the client, whether the download capacity is good, we wanted to reuse some of the ones that we have, but make it very developer friendly. One way we did in the beginning was we told everyone, write all this code in your controllers, like go call the JavaScript, the Java library to do formatting and Java library to do localization. You do it by yourself. But what we saw was like a lot of like duplicate code again, unmaintainable code, people using their own patterns and doing stuff. So we wrote a small piece of library, which again will be open source. Try to come up with a name for that. It's going to be called something like dust.settle, I think. That's the final name we settled on. We just had names to think about. So what it basically does is processes the map that you gave it, so Java map, the template, looks for these special tags that we call as server-side helpers, processes them, calls the corresponding Java library, gets the data, creates a X-prime map. I mean, X-prime map is something other than the original domain that you got. So that's the example. I mean, I don't know if it's clear from the back. Something like, like a formatted micro name came back in the JSON. That's not something you wrote in the template, but somehow the framework in between was, or the library in between was smart enough to inject that. One other thing I want to really highlight is it works in the context, just like how Dust walks the tree and then it renders in the context it was declared. Even this processor is a walker that walks this template, injects the data right in the context it was declared. A typical example here is when you have people and you have 25 names in that list, you want a formatted name for every single person. And this is rocket science. This is every templating language and library does it by itself, right? I mean, when you write JSPs, you put a loop and then you call, within that inline, you call a JavaScript, like a Java library to go and format that name and then put it back. We didn't do anything different. We basically used the concept of Dust as a helper. Tomorrow, we're trying to migrate each of these to client. If we end up migrating each of them to the JavaScript, we will change pre.fmt to just fmt because it becomes a client helper then. So that's the transition we want to get there. And how fast and how long, I mean, it's just dependent on how much we can do. But it's seamless again. It's no special learning curve for people about a new syntax, nothing different from Dust syntax. These helpers do take parameters, like you can come up with your own helper even on client that takes args, then params, and then you can come up with your own language for every helper. So this is what we do. We basically use what LinkedIn came up with in terms of, all it's saying is, it's a name formatter, but it needs a micro name to be printed there. It takes a bunch of arguments, and these are all Dust variables there. Same syntax, no special syntax. We use the same walker that the Dust.js uses to walk that template, resolve variables, nothing different from what the JavaScript does. But downside, we have replicated it into Java, but I think, as I said, you always don't get everything in one thing. You have to find a bridge, and we found that.
So is there a copy of the template that is existing on the server side and then a JavaScript compiled copy that's out in the CDN?
No.
No. Okay, so
That's magic. So I'll go through that. So if you're asking why I said no, here's what it is. So there's a template that you wrote called x.tl, right? You added these special helpers. We processed into something called xprime.tl. If you look at xprime.tl, it doesn't have those server-side helpers in it. Because if you ended up sending that server-side helper, there would be a JavaScript error because it doesn't understand that helper.
Right.
So that is totally CDN cached. And I think I put a double exclamation mark here. That was like the biggest, I think, the game that we had was this. We wanted to cache these templates, and if you have all these dynamic helpers, like different for each of them, that means we lose caching, right? I mean,
so xprime.tl gets turned into xprime.js.
yes.
But x.tl still must be around somewhere so that you can...
It's in your trunk, in your SVN repository. It never goes down to the browser.
So maybe I'm missing it then. When does map get converted to map prime? Who sticks the...
So if you go back, here's the thing. So the V8 part, you think about it as... okay. The part where is that aggregator, the engine, think of that as a library running there that actually converts xmap to xprime map.
And that puts in the format that came from the pre-template?
Yeah.
So it must have the pre-template available.
But it's still on the server though. It's not gone to the client. Yeah.
But there is a server copy and then a prime version that's CDN. Is that what's happening?
Server copy is basically your SVN, like the source.
But you've shipped it to production somehow. It's packaged in some
Yeah,
way.
that's like we in dev, it's in a file system we look up, and then of course in production you need to package those stuff into this bundle that this engine has access to it. So we call them like static wars. Basically, that's the terminology we use. So we package all the templates. So every template is available to every app across LinkedIn. So we package all of them in one bundle, and that library there has access to each one of those templates. So it's able to pick that guy and then process it and then shove the JSON that it needs and then works.
So the JSON comes through, gets hit by the first template, then gets returned out to the client, which has the compiled version of the second template, and then it actually does the...
That's xprime JSON and xprime TL. So the JSON that you got from your RESTly or your domain is not the same that goes to the browser. And then you see how you can mix and match. By just plugging in a different tag there, I can actually create a new JSON. No, it's hot reloaded. No need to compile anything. It's all refresh. You add a new tag. So if you instead of want a name.micro, I want a name.full. That's some LinkedIn logo. I just refresh the browser and I get it. So developer velocity was something that was like keen on our head because we've been using JVM stack and we're burned by people saying, writing a page on LinkedIn takes forever, right? Like developing a page on LinkedIn takes forever because you have to do this hot like build and deploy steps for every single thing. And I'll say how we're trying to improve that with these templates too. So I don't want to spend too much time here, but any questions that you want to take up? Yep, Brendan.
So in the example that you had up there, it looked like the raw fields were being stripped out of xprime map and not being passed to the client in xprime JSON.
Yeah. Interesting. Very good observation.
Is that a capability of the platform as well?
Yeah.
I don't see anything to triggers it in here?
That's a great question. I hope somebody noticed that. So a lot of the things that people would ask is like, the real domain data that we have is really not usable on the client. Like you always make it presentable, you format it, you like localize it. Should I send first and last name down to the client? No. What really the client needs, that's why we like optimize on the payload. What we really need is the stuff in the blue. Client doesn't need the stuff in the client. I mean, like in the green. What did I say? Doesn't need the stuff in the green. It needs the stuff in the blue, and that's why it's color coded. That's another optimization we thought about it. Like if there is a framework, there's a library in between. Like let's be smart about what we send it to the client. Let's not send anything and everything that it's actually declared by the controller. Let's kind of annotate it. Let's kind of tell people what you really want to send down. We'll send only those things out there. Does that answer your question, right?
I was still a little curious about how we would actually trigger it, but I assume.
It's the annotation part. So that nice that you use the word curious. A lot of curious questions, one at least. So it's usually an annotation on these like maps that we have that tell us whether it has to be a client or an external data field or not. So you could use any other construct in your language to kind of annotate and tell, if you use an average schema to say something, if you use another JSON schema. JSON doesn't provide annotation, I guess, but I'm sure anything else can, you can annotate and say only certain fields of the map need to be sent down. I don't want everything else. Use other pieces of the information in this map to process and create more data. And all in the library so that you don't repeat in every Java or other code. So I want to lastly end with this thing about people saying it's all cool and everything. Really, we wrote a blog post. Are we using it? Yes. Actually, we even forked it. We even forked the actual Dust.js library. Because as we started using it, and Rich is one of the person who works in PayPal, and we have like a lot of conversation on all the stuff that we've been talking about did not come for free. Some things had to be tuned. Some of the grammar was kind of clunky. It is a very strict grammar. It doesn't allow extra white spaces and all that. So we forked it for good. We forked it for one reason, because the original author is not responsive. So we don't know. I mean, we would really want him to come and work here and help us, but he's not responsive. So we forked it. And that's our LinkedIn fork. We have a GitHub site. You can check out. We have constant updates that we do, and then anybody can participate and want to come and learn and then contribute to it. Biggest reason I think we moved to Dust was not because that it's cool. I think one of the biggest reasons we moved to Dust was this. As a company, as a team that we're growing, we wanted to use something that's not proprietary. We wanted to use a language that actually, makes developers be happy, sometimes even cool enough to use it. I mean, that's the truth. It's not the truth of we wanted to use something that's out there. So as a promise, I think we will always try to be open of anything we do, any extensions we do, any extra things that we do, even the library that we're talking of. I'm in the process of doing it, and it's something that people may use it or may not use it. But, other than LinkedIn. But I'm sure that people can derive inspiration of doing something from what we've done. So we will always make it open. So seriously, you say, you gave me this big lecture for an hour, and you talk about Dust and like helpers and partials and everything else, but does it really work for me? Can you give me something that I could go and use? Yes. So let's talk about what's changed between using JSPs and what's changed for using Dust templates. There are a couple of teams here, and some have been burnt because we've made them guinea pigs in the beginning and then experimented in all these things. But there are other teams in the last 2 months who have also started to using this Dust and found it immensely, hugely beneficial to use them. I'll tell you why. So this is basically the metrics that I came up with. IMO, nothing that I hold for LinkedIn for. Most often I see when as a framework team is most people develop features which are very data driven. Like LinkedIn is a data driven company, right? We have so much data out there, and a lot of our products have to use more like surface this data in terms of metrics, in terms of algorithms, and it's basically a list of data we want to show, like who viewed your profile, people you may know, groups you may want to join, company you may like. It goes on. Connections that you just recently connected with. All of these are just 60 to 65%, I would say, are purely display only thing. And there are other flows, like, there's a registration app that works on, which is a little different from read only. You need to do a lot of server-side, validation at times, and, you want to have a flow. There are certain other use cases too, but majority of the use cases, I would say, are very read only. And I think our development process has been so bad that, it takes forever to write a page. So this is the concept that we want to actually build on and improve, is this parallel web development. I know everybody understands what design is and what development is, but I think there's always a disconnect we see. Like the designers do their stuff in mockups and Photoshops, and then the developers use stuff like JSPs and templates. And that slows down the product the way we ship it. That slows down the iteration. And you're far too engrossed in the details of like a Java class and what library to use than actually looking at the interaction design of it. So we want to bridge that gap. We want to use like our templating language as a single language that both designers and developers learn. We want developers to actually become designers and designers to become developers. It's a dream. It's not there yet, but I think that's the foreign goal that I'm talking of. This is something that each one of you may be affected with. Anybody sitting here may be affected with and like, okay, I can work with the designer closely, and like if the designer understands this language, we can iterate quicker. And this is concept of mock data that we're trying to use a lot here. So we don't have to rely on real services. We can create a mock file, and that's how our SVN trunk looks like. For every single app, for example, this is a very, UMay is an app that I've created just for the sake of it. And basically it's a page with 4 modules. People you may know, groups you may like, companies you may want to join, etc., etc. And every single is its own embed. And parallel to that, we have a JSON file for each of them that actually is the data model for the template. So you just have full control on what data model you want. You're not relying on your Java engineer. You're not relying on somebody backend writing your data store. You're not waiting until they create an Oracle table or like a Voldemort or a Cassandra store. You're not waiting for any of that. You want to do UI. You're strictly here to ship products, and then you do it by yourself. So that's the concept of using templating to me. And why do you say, was it not possible with JSPs? Actually, it would be possible, but I think we could have done that even with JSPs. I mean, because it's a templating language that uses data and there's nothing very fancy about it. But the fact that this whole rendering just happens in the browser and you don't need a specific, like a web app like Tomcat and JSP engine to render makes it much easier, I feel. You can have a library that takes your template, that's what we're developing, that library that we want to open source, that takes a template, takes a mock JSON that you give and builds UI for you. And you don't worry about like the real stack or the full LinkedIn stack. So really, at the end, I want to really say I'm going to keep it real and actually tell you like there are features that develop in LinkedIn that use it, and some of them are here. These are like really big apps that serve a lot of traffic in LinkedIn that have used Dust. And they may not have used all the things that I've talked to you in the past few slides. As I said, it was always an iterative thing for us. We've learned from our mistakes. We've learned from what we've not learned. And we're trying to adapt the good things in each of these apps. And then some of these people who've developed one of these few pages are right here or may not be here, but each of them have used it. And then have been like great feedback for what could be improved on each of them. And as I said, I'll try, and these are some of our motivations, as I said, try to make our developers really do things fast. And we're not trying to move everything to the client. And I want to say that I met with one of the Twitter architects in a few conferences that I was there. And I think he gave a very good statement. Things that are not supposed to be done on client should not be done on client. And things that can be done on client should be done on client. It's a very subtle statement because you can always think that everything can be done on client. We're not trying to do everything on client, but we may try to move everything to JavaScript. Because it's a unifying language for us that, we build our infrastructure in JavaScript, we can scale a server-side JavaScript engine and still achieve the benefits of it. Lastly, this was a story about Curious Case of Benjamin Button. And then I saw the slide, if you watch that movie backwards, it's basically a story about a normal guy. And I hope if you see this presentation backwards, it's just a story about a normal web developer's life at LinkedIn. And it's nothing more than that. And I made it up into so many slides, but it's just what every web developer or front-end engineer does at LinkedIn. And it's an effort from our team to improve that. So this is the Holy Grail. If you didn't listen to anything, don't worry. There are wikis out there. If you were sleeping, don't worry. There are wikis out there. These are a few links for internal and external. And I think one thing we want to drive across at LinkedIn is, as part of this bootcamp, maybe is think about UI and not a full stack dev, in a full stack of the dev mode. When you're developing stuff, don't worry about everything. Just worry about shipping really good design, really good interaction features, and that you could do with Dust templates. And that's basically it. So that's our logo. We have t-shirts that I don't have right now, but and then that was a bummer, isn't it? So please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm sure I'm going to send you a LinkedIn t-shirt that says We Dust. All right, thank you.